When too big to fail demands a bailout, you get a treat, but I get...
There was a time when lawmakers in New Zealand convinced themselves of a radical idea, that the government could simply step away from managing the nation's market and infrastructure, leaving it entirely to private enterprise. Before these reforms took hold, the country's economy was dragging. State departments were deeply inefficient, heavily overstaffed, and required constant, heavy taxpayer funding just to keep operating. To fix this, the state aggressively pivoted. They corporatized these public departments overnight. By applying a hard commercial lens to these services, they forced rapid productivity improvements through severe cost-cutting and immediate staff reductions. And at first, the strategy seemed to work brilliantly. The most immediate victory was how effectively this shift transferred severe financial risks straight off the taxpayer's balance sheet. When the 1998 Asian financial crisis decimated the value of the nation's timber assets, the Crown didn't pay a cent. A private consortium had purchased the Forestry Corporation, meaning those private buyers absorbed the devastating financial write-downs entirely. But this early victory created a dangerous psychological trap. Policymakers developed a deep, unearned confidence. They assumed this light-handed regulation, relying purely on the threat of open competition, could manage absolutely any sector. They took the regulatory logic that worked perfectly for a commercial pine forest and blindly applied it to the vital life-or-death infrastructure of the entire nation. When a public service is corporatized, its governance legally shifts. Under the Companies Act, directors must prioritize profit maximization over public obligations. Critics realized this structural metamorphosis was a stepping stone, facilitating the rapid sale and offshore alienation of national assets to transnational corporations. Subjecting essential infrastructure to the demands of private capital exposes a predictable flaw. Private markets operate on short-term profitability imperatives. They prioritize immediate dividends and actively avoid sinking money into long-lived community infrastructure. Look at the privatization of New Zealand Rail, later known as Transrail. The private operators running the network made a highly rational, entirely destructive choice. They extracted maximum dividends for their shareholders while starving the rail system of the funds required for essential maintenance. Without that critical funding, the physical network rapidly degraded. Tracks rusted, rolling stock aged, and commuter rail projects were completely abandoned because they couldn't be justified on short-term funding contracts. If you force lifeblood public infrastructure to survive on the short-term constraints of private capital, chronic underinvestment is the guaranteed result. The government thought they could prevent bad corporate behavior by leaning on generic competition laws, deliberately avoiding robust, industry-specific oversight. This blind faith in light-handed regulation failed completely in telecommunications. Without strict oversight, Telecom easily maintained its monopoly power, deliberately stalling necessary investments in broadband. In 1998, the state tried ownership unbundling of the electricity sector. Prohibiting companies from owning both distribution and supply businesses was meant to push prices down. Instead, it sparked massive corporate mergers, rapidly consolidating the market into powerful, vertically integrated gen-tailors. The policy achieved the exact opposite of its intent. Retail competition actually decreased, and residential power prices drove up. When you design structural reforms assuming the mere threat of competition will keep corporations in line, you often end up creating stronger, more entrenched monopolies. Eventually, the most severe consequence of this era became impossible to ignore. When a private market catastrophically fails in a critical sector, the state is inevitably dragged back in. Privatization aims to remove financial risk from the government's balance sheet, but lawmakers quickly discovered they could never truly escape liability for institutions that are simply too big to fail. Following a period of financial liberalization, the Bank of New Zealand accumulated massive bad loans. To protect the broader financial system, the government had to intervene with a staggering taxpayer-funded bailout. The same dynamic played out in national aviation. When Air New Zealand faced total collapse after its disastrous acquisition of Ansett Australia, the state was forced to execute yet another massive intervention to save the airline. The public eventually found the consequences of these hard commercial constraints unacceptable. The government was forced to buy back the rotting Transrail assets, and they literally had to reverse their own electricity unbundling legislation to allow the market to reintegrate. This doesn't mean private capital has no place in public infrastructure, Models of partial privatization, where the government retains a firm ownership stake but introduces private capital to drive efficiency, have proven highly rewarding. Entities like the Ports of Auckland and Trustpower thrived under this exact model. A government can successfully corporatize a department, slash bloat, and even privatize profits. But when it comes to the essential pillars of a functioning society, a nation can never truly offload its ultimate systemic liability.
This is a true collaboration between human and machine. Elevate your perspective.